One claiming decision quietly cost this retiree $182,000. Not to fraud, not to a market crash, to a single checkbox marked at 62, the moment a monthly benefit locked in for life. The money was already earned. Decades of payroll deductions had funded it, and most of it was simply left on the table. Here is what makes this dangerous. The choice is irreversible. It is often made by default the first year eligibility opens, before anyone has modeled what the other ages actually pay. The retiree never sees the gap. There is no statement that lists the benefits foregone. The loss is invisible precisely because it never arrives. So a question worth sitting with: if the math is public and the calculators are free and the rules are written plainly by the Social Security Administration, why do most people still lock in the wrong claiming age? This reconstruction models every age from 62 to 70 for one representative earner. The answer isn't 62, it isn't 70. That gap didn't open at 70. It opened the day the choice was made. Rewind the tape to the year this earner turned 62. Call him a composite, a model, not a person. A private sector worker, 38 years of steady payroll history, a full retirement age of 67, and a benefit at that age of roughly $2,400 a month. Average health. No terminal diagnosis. The kind of profile the modeling treats as ordinary, because it is. The timeline up to that first eligible birthday looks unremarkable. The mortgage is nearly paid. A 401k sits somewhere in the low six figures, respectable but not commanding. The paycheck is winding down. A partial retirement is already underway. And on a Tuesday, an eligibility notice arrives from the Social Security Administration confirming what he already suspected. Benefits can begin now. That notice is the turning point, not because it forces a decision, but because it makes one feel overdue. Study the logic as it actually ran, because it was not careless. Claiming at 62 would deliver about $1,680 a month, the permanently reduced figure, roughly 70% of the full retirement benefit. Waiting to 67 would raise it to $2,400. Waiting to 70 would push it past $2,900 through delayed retirement credits. He saw those numbers. He was not uninformed. What moved him was a chain of reasoning that sounds airtight in a kitchen at 8 a.m. First, the money is there now, and 8 years of checks is 8 years of checks. Second, nobody is promised tomorrow. Take it while you can. Third and heaviest, waiting until 70 meant surrendering roughly $1,680 every month for 8 years. More than $160,000 in benefits never collected, on the bet that he'd live long enough to earn it back. Framed that way, waiting looked like the gamble and claiming looked like the safe move. There is history underneath that instinct. When early claiming at 62 was written into the program in the early 1960s, it was designed as an escape hatch, a bridge for workers whose bodies gave out before full retirement age. It was never meant to be the default, yet it quietly became one. For decades, 62 has been the single most common age Americans start benefits, the box most often checked the first year it can be. So he checked it. The reduced amount began arriving. For a while, and this is the part the autopsy cannot skip, it felt like vindication. The deposits landed on schedule, the budget balanced. The neighbors who waited were, in his eyes, betting against their own mortality while he collected. Nothing about the early months suggested a mistake had been made. That is the consequence worth naming precisely. The cost of claiming at 62 does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a penalty notice or a clawback. It arrives as an absence, a slightly smaller deposit than it might have been, month after month, for the rest of a life that turns out to be longer than the fear assumed. The gap compounds in silence. By the time it becomes visible, if it ever does, the decision is a decade behind him and cannot be undone. A decision that felt responsible, conservative, refusing to gamble, set the trajectory that would eventually total $182,000 in foregone benefits. How does the safe choice become the expensive one? The rewind reveals the mechanism, but not yet the flaw. Because every step of his reasoning leaned on a single comparison. The whole case for claiming early rested entirely on one number nobody in that kitchen thought to question. That one number was the break-even age. And to be fair to the man in the kitchen, it is the most intuitive tool the whole decision offers. Here is how it works, because the mechanism matters more than the verdict it produces. Claiming early hands you smaller checks starting sooner. Waiting hands you larger checks starting later. At some point down the timeline, the person who waited has collected enough extra per month to erase the head start the early claimer built up. That crossover point is the break-even age. For this earner, comparing 62 against 67, it lands somewhere around 78 to 80. The exact figure shifts with the assumptions, but the neighborhood is stable. The logic is clean. If he dies before that age, claiming at 62 wins on total dollars collected. If he lives past it, waiting wins. So the question seems to reduce to a single coin flip. Will he make it to 79 or not? Take that reasoning at its strongest, because it deserves the steelman. Break-even is not superstition. The arithmetic is real. Every dollar collected at 62 is a dollar in hand years earlier, and a dollar in hand can be invested, spent, or simply enjoyed while the body still cooperates. There is a defensible discount on future money, and a man with average health, looking at a break-even in his late 70s, could reasonably conclude the odds were close to even. He wasn't being reckless. He was answering the exact question break-even put in front of him. And that is precisely where the trap closes. Break-even treats the decision as a bet on a date of death, a single point on a calendar you either reach or you don't. But that is not the risk a retiree actually faces. Nobody experiences their own life as a coin that lands heads at 79. The real danger isn't dying early. Dying early, coldly, solves its own financial problem. The danger is living a long time with a permanently smaller check. Look at what break-even quietly ignores. It optimizes for total dollars collected across a life, as if the goal were to win an accounting contest against the Social Security Administration. But a benefit isn't a lump sum to maximize. It is income insurance against the one outcome you cannot budget for: outliving your money. Larger monthly checks are most valuable, precisely in the scenario break-even treats as a loss. The long life, the years past 85, past 90, when the 401k is thin and the paycheck is a memory. Break-even answers a question, and answers it correctly. It just answers the wrong one. It asks, when will total dollars collected be highest if death arrives on schedule? The question that should govern the decision is how to protect the version of yourself who lives far longer than expected, the version most exposed to running out. Those are not the same question, and they point to opposite answers. The man in the kitchen ran the break-even math honestly, and it told him to claim early. It would tell most people the same. That is what makes it a trap rather than a mistake. It isn't wrong arithmetic. It's the right arithmetic pointed at the wrong target. This is how a decision that felt safe became the most expensive one. He hedged against dying too soon. The threat was living too long. Break-even asks when you die. It never once asks how long you might live. Shift the question, and the whole decision changes shape. Break-even asks when the retiree dies. The better question is quieter and harder. How long might he live? Not on average, but at the far edge, in the tail where the money has to last longest. Those are different numbers, and the gap between them is where the mistake lives. Average life expectancy is a headline figure, and headlines mislead here. For a 62-year-old American man in average health, the actuarial tables put life expectancy somewhere in the low 80s. That single number is what most people carry into the kitchen. It is also the wrong number to plan around, because it describes the middle of a distribution, not the risk at its edge. Consider what that distribution actually contains. Life expectancy is a coin that has already been flipped many times and averaged. Roughly half of a given cohort outlives the average. A meaningful share reaches the late 80s, and a real minority, not a rounding error, crosses 90. Planning to the average is planning as if you were guaranteed to be exactly typical. Nobody is. Half the room, by definition, is not. Now run the comparison the break-even math refused to run. Take the same composite earner and imagine two futures side by side. In the first, he claims at 62 and dies at 79, right around the break-even age. Here the early choice wins, cleanly. He collected more total dollars, enjoyed them earlier, and the years of larger checks he skipped, never had to be paid for. On these facts, claiming at 62 was correct, and no amount of hindsight changes that. In the second future, everything is identical except the ending. He claims at 62 and lives to 92. Now the reduced check, that permanent 30% haircut, is no longer a clever head start. It is a leak that runs for 30 years. Every month past the break-even, the version of him who waited would have been ahead, and the gap widens with each deposit that never grew. By his late 80s, when the 401k has thinned and the paycheck is 2 decades gone, he is living on the smallest benefit the system would let him lock in the exact stretch of life when a larger one would have mattered most. Same man, same decision, 2 endings. In one, 62 is the hero. In the other, it is the quiet architect of a shortfall he cannot reverse. This is the application that reframes the entire choice. Claiming age is not primarily a bet on longevity, it is insurance against it. The larger monthly benefit earned by waiting is worth the least in the futures where the retiree dies early, and worth the most in the futures where he lives long. That is the definition of insurance. It pays off precisely when you most need it, and can least afford to be wrong. Break-even optimizes for the futures where insurance is unnecessary. Longevity risk lives in the futures where it is everything. So the decision stops being, will I beat the average, and becomes something sharper. Which failure would be worse to live inside? Leaving some dollars uncollected because life ran short, or facing a long life on a permanently smaller income? For most people, those are not symmetrical. Dying early with money left on the table is a problem the dead do not experience. Outliving your income is a problem the living feel every month. Whose life expectancy, then, actually decides this? The retiree assumes it is his own. But the one number that governs a married earner's decision may not belong to him at all. The retiree ran his entire calculation on one life, his own. That was the deepest flaw in the kitchen, deeper than the break-even trap, because it wasn't an error in arithmetic. It was an error in whose life the arithmetic was even about. Contrast the two framings directly. A single person choosing a claiming age is, in fact, betting on one lifespan. When the checks stop, they stop for everyone. But a married earner is not making a single life decision, no matter how the calculator presents it. He is setting the terms of a benefit that can outlive him, one that continues paying after he is gone, to someone who had no seat at that 8 a.m. table. Here is the central truth the model forces into view. When the higher earner in a couple dies, the survivor does not keep both Social Security checks. The rule is generic but unforgiving. The survivor keeps the larger of the two benefits and loses the smaller. So the higher earner's claiming decision does not merely set his own income, it sets the floor the survivor will live on for every year she outlives him. That reframes the reduced check entirely. When this earner locked in roughly $1,680 at 62 instead of the $2,900 he could have reached by waiting, he did not shrink his own income for his lifetime alone. He shrank the survivor benefit permanently for a spouse who is statistically likely to be the one left. Women in these couples tend to live longer and are frequently the lower earner, meaning the survivor often spends years, sometimes more than a decade, living on exactly the benefit the higher earner chose to reduce. There is a historical parallel worth drawing here, because the shape of this mistake is old. Traditional defined benefit pensions offered the same fork. A retiree could take a larger single life pension that paid more each month but stopped at his death, or a smaller joint and survivor pension that paid less but continued to a spouse. For decades, retirees chose the bigger single life check, the number that looked better on the day, and surviving spouses were left with nothing when it vanished. The pattern was so damaging that federal law was eventually rewritten to require spousal consent before a married worker could waive survivor protection. The lesson Congress drew was blunt. People systematically optimize for the check they can see today and forget the household that inherits the consequence. Social Security embeds the same fork, but with no consent form and no signature required from the spouse. The higher earner claims early, feels responsible, balances the budget, and quietly signs the survivor up for the smaller floor without her ever being asked. Now the decision unfolds into something the individual math could never capture. The relevant question is not how long the higher earner lives. It is how long either of them lives. The larger benefit, earned by waiting, keeps keeps paying across 2 lifespans joined end to end, first through his years, then through hers. The probability that at least one member of a 62-year-old couple reaches 90 is dramatically higher than the probability that any single person does. 2 lives stacked together stretch the tail of the distribution far longer than one. The case for waiting, already strong on longevity risk, grows stronger the moment a spouse enters the room. The higher earner's delayed check is not just his insurance, it is the survivor's foundation. So the answer to whose life expectancy decides this is not the retirees. It is the longer of the two, the survivors. On that basis, delaying looked like the clear winner. Until the tax code entered the room. Delaying looked like the clear winner. Until you noticed that not every benefit dollar reaches the retiree. Some of it is taxed away. And the tax rule is written in a way almost designed to punish the larger check. Start with the number the model has to reckon with, 85%. That is the maximum share of a Social Security benefit that can be pulled into federal taxable income, not 85% lost to tax, 85% exposed to tax. But the figure hides more than it reveals, because the switch that turns benefits taxable isn't the benefit itself. It's a second number most retirees have never heard of. That number is provisional income. The Social Security Administration and the IRS don't ask only what your benefit is. They add your other income, pension, part-time wages, and critically the taxable withdrawals from that 401k to half of your Social Security benefit. That combined figure is provisional income. Cross the first threshold, and up to 50% of benefits become taxable. Cross the second, and up to 85% does. Here is what the 85% figure conceals. Those thresholds have a peculiar feature almost no other part of the tax code shares. They are not indexed to inflation. Written into law in 1983 and 1993 and never adjusted, they now catch ordinary middle-income retirees who were never the intended target. What was designed to tax the affluent has quietly drifted down onto the median. Now watch what that does to the delayer specifically. The retiree who waits to 70 collects a benefit near $2,900 instead of $1,680. Larger check, half of which counts toward provisional income. And the years spent waiting are years he had to live on something, most often withdrawals from that 401k, each of which is itself taxable and stacks directly onto provisional income. The very strategy that maximizes the benefit tends to push the retiree deeper across both thresholds, taxing a larger share of a larger check. There is a sharper edge still. Because benefits phase into taxation as provisional income rises, an extra dollar of 401k withdrawal can make an additional 50 or 85 cents of benefit taxable at the same time. The effective marginal rate on that dollar can run well above the bracket printed on the tax table. Researchers call it the tax torpedo, a stretch of income where each added dollar is taxed as if it were worth far more. The delayer with the larger benefit and the withdrawal-heavy bridge years sails straight into it. So recalculate honestly. The case for waiting was built on a larger monthly check and a survivor benefit stretched across 2 lives. Both are real and both survive. But the tax code claws a slice back. The delayer's advantage over the early claimer is not the full gap between $1,680 and $2,900. It is that gap net of a heavier tax drag in the bridge years and a larger taxable share for life. That matters because it kills the extreme. Waiting all the way to 70 stacks the maximum benefit onto the maximum provisional income exposure, the largest check meeting the steepest tax. The pure longevity math says 70, the tax math says 70 overshoots, handing back at the top precisely what it worked to build. And now every force in the model pulls the answer somewhere different. Breakeven pulls towards 62, longevity pulls towards 70. Survivor benefits pull later still. Taxes pull back from the top. One age has to survive all 4 at once. 4 forces pulling in different directions, and only one age survives all of them at once. Put the number on the table before defending it. For this composite earner, average health, a full retirement age of 67, a spouse likely to outlive him, the age the model selects is 67. Full retirement age. Not the extreme that felt safe, not the extreme that maximized the check. The middle, the break-even math could never point to. Now defend it, because a number without a defense is just an opinion. Watch how 67 answers each force in turn. Against 62, it wins on the ground that actually matters. Claiming early protected the future where he dies at 79 and lost the future where he lives to 92. And for a married couple, the odds that at least one of them reaches the late 80s are not a coin flip. They are the likely case. 67 lifts the benefit off that reduced floor by roughly 40%, and it lifts the survivor's floor with it. The early check felt responsible. 67 is what responsibility looks like once the survivor has a seat at the table. Against 70, it wins on the ground the tax code exposed. Waiting to 70 buys the largest benefit, but it buys it with 8 years of 401k withdrawals stacked into provisional income, driving the delayers straight into the tax torpedo, and it hands the maximum check to the maximum taxable share. Those last 3 years of delayed credits are the most heavily taxed, the most exposed to the withdrawal drag, the least certain to be collected. 67 captures the bulk of the longevity protection and the bulk of the survivor benefit, then stops before the tax code starts handing the gains back. That is why the winner isn't a compromise. It's the point where every force is satisfied at once and none is pushed to its costly extreme. Longevity is ensured, the survivor is protected, the tax torpedo is dodged, and the break-even trap, the reasoning that started this whole autopsy, is exposed for what it was, the right arithmetic aimed at the wrong target. For a narrow set of earners, the answer moves. Someone single, in genuinely poor health, with no survivor to protect and no other income to bridge the gap. For that person, 62 can honestly win. The model does not pretend otherwise. But that is a specific case, not the default the man in the kitchen backed into. He wasn't that case. Most people aren't. Which finally answers the question this whole reconstruction has held open. If the math is public, the calculators are free, and the SSA writes the rules in plain language. Why do most people still lock in the wrong age? Because the free calculators answer the break-even question, and the break-even question is the wrong one. Because the default is to act, and acting early feels like caution while waiting feels like a gamble. Because the survivor has no seat at the table, and the tax torpedo has no warning label. Because the loss never arrives as a bill, it arrives as an absence, a slightly smaller deposit for the rest of a longer than expected life. The information was never hidden. The framing was. People don't lock in the wrong age because the math is inaccessible. They lock it in because nobody reframes the question before the checkbox does it for them. That was the $182,000. Not stolen, not lost to a crash. Foregone, one reduced deposit at a time, set in motion the morning a notice arrived, and a coin looked easy to flip. The number was never the hard part. The math fits on a single page. Acting on it deliberately before the default acts for you is the whole of the difficulty. Wealth is built to last, but only when the decision is made on purpose. This is education, not personalized advice.